Welcome to Week 3 of APH 501. This week we'll further explore spatial thinking from a geographical perspective, understand what spatial thinking practices underpin the STEM disciplines, and see why geographical thinking can benefit from some STEM understanding too. Last week we read about spatial relations, a type of spatial ability that geographers practice. These acts, such as reading patterns on maps, envisioning the world as we imagine mental maps, or making connections about locations as we overlay maps, are essential to the ways in which we understand all forms of geography. They're also practices that are part of the STEM disciplines. We understand that spatial thinking is positively correlated with success in the STEM disciplines, but what does that mean? What is it about spatial thinking that benefits someone engaged with science, technology, engineering, or math? When we delve further, we can identify particular practices associated with the act of spatial thinking in which STEM professionals engage. A few sample activities are listed here on this preliminary list. These aren't activities done only by STEM practitioners, but they are ones essential to success in STEM fields, and they are all spatial. One important idea to talk about here is the connection between visual thinking and spatial thinking. Unless our sight is impaired, every one of us is a visual learner, and we know that representations help us understand objects and items, whether they're simple or complex. Any kind of representation helps our working memory, especially if it's representing something that has moving parts or is itself in motion. We don't have to keep all steps of the motion in our working memory at a time. That's why animations help us. There's a side to STEM learning that is supported by physical models, manipulatives, models, physical representations, anything that lets us construct, transform, and manipulate our knowledge content is a support for spatial thinking and learning. We often turn to dynamic animations when we're trying to understand or explain a phenomena that involves space and time, rather than a static image. But static images are what we're likely to have access to more often, so we have to know how to design them and use them in effective ways. Here's an example of some different time-space images. The phases of the moon is pretty self-explanatory and elegant in its layout. The image that shows ocean and land temperatures is problematic in that it's labeled in a northern hemispheric centric way. Pretty early on, kids are taught that the northern and southern hemispheres have opposite seasons, so any figure showing annual changes should have the names of months indicated, not the seasons, which shift month by month. Lastly, there's a small figure that indicates the Great Ocean Conveyor Belt, showing the spatial pattern of warm and cold ocean currents throughout the Earth's oceans. What this figure doesn't indicate is any sense of time. It can take hundreds of years for water to make its way all around the cycle. Being able to interpret and envision the movement of shapes is arguably the most fundamental STEM spatial thinking connection. This is how we figured out that our continents were once joined and that plate tectonics exist. Watson and Crick spent months struggling with an incorrectly shaped DNA form before they had help from a fellow scientist named Rosalind Franklin, and together they came up with the double and twisted strands structure. And as a classic example of thinking with space, it's fundamental to STEM that we are able to organize and categorize information into arrangements that are themselves meaningful. This is what was meant by organizing, categorizing, and grouping as spatial activities. This process is critical with all forms of learning, across the language arts and social sciences too. Here's an example of an image that was very well designed to represent multiple dimensions of time and space. It demonstrates over the course of a year how, where, and when a bug moves through its life stages. Ron Eglash from the Science and Technology Department at the Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute has created a website with resources for math instruction. It's called Culturally Situated Design Tools, and they're all math-based lessons that are all connected to visual images, patterns, and cultural artifacts from African, African American, Native American, Latino, and youth subcultures. The word spatial does not appear anywhere in the entire collection, but everything is spatial about this. Every module includes tutorials and lesson plans for classrooms. They have the math and physics behind skateboarding, fractals in African art, and XY coordinates behind the design of Navajo rugs. I'll share the link to this in the webpage for this week. While these may seem to be only math activities, they also give great insights into cultural geography, too. So spatial thinking informs STEM learning, but what about geography, and especially human geography? A couple of years ago, the National Research Council published a report called Understanding the Changing Planet that laid out 11 different strategic directions for the geographical sciences. These address issues like climate change, biological diversity, and globalization, but also challenge us to improve on our ways to communicate and visualize to children and the wider public about such issues. Spatial thinking is involved in each and every one of these, and in fact we can't understand them or even begin to reach solutions until we're practicing spatial and geospatial thinking. The report authors identified these 11 broad and essential questions that represent some of the most pressing issues of the next few decades. How are we changing the physical environment of Earth's surface? How can we best preserve biological diversity and protect endangered ecosystems? How are climate and other environmental changes affecting the vulnerabilities of coupled human-environment systems? How and where will 10 billion people live on Earth? How will we sustainably feed everyone in the coming decade and beyond? How does where people live affect their health? How is the movement of people, goods, and ideas transforming the world? How is economic globalization affecting inequality? How are geopolitical shifts influencing peace and stability? How might we better observe, analyze, and visualize a changing world? And what are the societal implications of citizen mapping and mapping citizens? Some of these are clearly linked directly to what we study within AP Human Geography. And this brings us back to the spatial side of STEM learning. All of those research questions are relevant at geographic scales ranging from the local, neighborhood, up to the global scale. None of them has a single simple answer. All of them will require understanding that bridges both human geography knowledge as well as the knowledge and solutions that science, technology, engineering, and math might offer. For example, question number 4, how and where will 10 billion people live on Earth? A question of this scale cannot be answered without taking advantage of remote sensing techniques. Interpreting remotely sensed satellite images requires the ability to group, categorize, and observe patterns. Returning to our spatial thinking definition, it involves the ability to visualize and interpret locations, distances, directions, and change. Knowledge from human geography will provide some explanation of how people might live in some places, and insights into the why as well. But a holistic and comprehensive answer to this question requires an application of spatial concepts and spatial thinking to the science, technology, and human interpretation of the geographic situation. So the answers are a blend of quantitative and qualitative information. Or question number 9, how are geopolitical shifts influencing peace and stability? Here's a map that depicts a growing trend of xenophobic political parties, meaning those that have an intense dislike of what they perceive as people to be as foreigners, meaning those that have an intense dislike of what they perceive to be foreigners. And this is across Europe today. In order to understand this trend, observations need to be compared and categorized. Events and actions can be considered in sequence to detect what is having an effect on others regionally. Social networks, too, can be analyzed by their distances and directions. although these won't always be distances and directions that are geographically bound within a social network. In summary, part of what distinguishes the STEM disciplines is their attention to data, their approach to organizing it, and their strategies for communicating about and with it. Students of human geography need to do the same thing: make observations, interpret them, draw inferences, and share the stories. The patterns and content of human geography is very much wrapped up in those 11 different research questions that the geographical sciences are addressing. There will never be a single solution to any of those questions, and only through a blend of STEM approaches and geographical knowledge, both human geography and all other dimensions, can we even begin to understand the questions, much less address them. That's all for now. Enjoy the activities this week.